Great. Well, it's Friday, June the 19th. We are a week into this war operation of Israel in Iran to take out Iran's, or the regime in Tehran, to put it more specifically, the regime's nuclear program. I'm with Professor Steven Zipperstein from UCLA in California. Welcome, Steve. Great to have you back.
Thank you, Andrea. I would just say that it's actually Thursday, June 19th. It feels like it's Friday, but it's
You're
only
quite right.
Thursday
It's
still.
Thursday. Actually, well, let's start again. That's pretty stupid. Yeah,
Okay, that's
absolutely.
okay.
Yeah. There you go. Okay, it's Thursday, June the 19th, and we are almost a week into this operation of Israel, started last Friday in the middle of the night to take out the Iranian regime's nuclear operation, its capacity to build nuclear weapons. This is what Israel is afraid of. A lot of discussion at the moment about whether this is legal, whether Israel had the right at all to go into Iran, which is foreign sovereign territory of the Republic of Iran. You can't just walk into any country and do what you like. You have to operate within the confines of international law. So we're here to explore what is the framework of international law? How do we analyze this? And I think to do that, we need to understand the context. So Professor Steve Zipperstein from UCLA in California, thank you for being on the program. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Andrew. Great to be here with you.
Steve is a senior fellow at Think and the region better, at least as well as any analyst and legal academic that I know in the field. So Steve, you might just want to sort of paint the picture for us and help us understand the context, the background, and why Israel took this action. I think it took a lot of people by surprise. No doubt there was a lot behind the scenes that we're not aware of. And there was a lot going on at the time. There was a meeting lined up in Oman, I think, that the Americans were going to have with the Iranians. So why now? And we'll come back to the question of justification and legality.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Great to be with you. I think it's important for us to begin with the historical context in which this conflict is occurring. Of course, the current Iranian regime, a theocratic Islamist regime, came into power in 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, very quickly followed by an attack on the United States Embassy in Tehran, the holding of American workers in the embassy, diplomats, as hostage for nearly a year. And that began a long series of increasingly hostile acts perpetrated by the regime against targets in Europe, the United States, Israel, Jewish targets around the world. The 1980s and 1990s saw multiple terrorist attacks around the region and around the world. Hundreds of Americans were killed in those attacks, hundreds of Israelis attacks occurring even as far away as Buenos Aires, Argentina, when the Iranians perpetrated the bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992, and then the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires 2 years later in 1994. And Iran was never, ever held accountable for any of these terrorist attacks, and it drew a couple of lessons. The Iranians realized that they could avoid any form of accountability or punishment if they engaged proxies on their behalf, Hezbollah and others, to do their dirty work for them around the world, number one. And number two, the Iranians were so emboldened by the success of their terror campaigns in the 80s and 90s that they decided then to take the next step and develop nuclear weapons. Why nuclear weapons? Iran not under threat from anyone. The Americans never responded by attacking Iran for these various terror attacks. So why would Iran need to develop nuclear weapons? Because the original Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor, the Ayatollah Khamenei, made it the official policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran that one day the state of Israel would be destroyed. Or in the words of Khamenei, who has tweeted this multiple times, the state of Israel would be eradicated. And so Iran in the 2000s began very, very actively pursuing nuclear weapons, leading to the Obama administration and the other members of the UN Security Council and the EU in 2015 signing the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, nuclear deal with Iran, under which Iran supposedly agreed to pursue nuclearization solely for civilian purposes, electricity, energy, and so forth. Iran was allowed to continue enriching uranium under that deal up to a limit of 3.67%. The deal did nothing, however, to prevent Iran from continuing to arm and fund and train terrorist groups around the region and around the world. The deal did nothing to halt Iran's pursuit of ballistic missile technology, which of course would be needed to deliver a nuclear bomb. The deal freed up $100 billion of cash that the Americans had been holding since the Iranian Revolution. Plane loads of cash flown to Iran. Iran used that cash to pursue ballistic missile technology, to fund and arm its proxies. And worst of all, the deal had a sunset clause that said that in 10 years from 2015, meaning this year, right now, 2025, October 2025, the deal would expire. And Iran thereafter would be free to pursue the development of nuclear weapons. And so President Trump in his first term withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal, but Iran still, along with the other members of the Security Council and the EU, Iran said, well, we'll continue to comply. But they really weren't. They were on the side doing everything they could to further the pursuit of nuclear weapons. And by the way, when the 2015 nuclear deal was agreed, the Obama White House issued a piece of paper selling the deal to the public, and that piece of paper in the form of a PowerPoint slide said that without the nuclear deal, Iran in 2015 would be 2 to 3 months away from has continued its work on nuclear weapons. And as of last week, a week ago today, June 12, the governing board of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, issued a very strong resolution condemning Iran for violating not just the JCPOA, but for violating its solemn obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty by doing what? By racing to develop a bomb. As of last week, most estimates had it that Iran was about a week or two away from being able to assemble as many as 10 nuclear weapons. And so Iran continuing to develop nuclear weapons for the purpose of destroying the state of Israel, that left Israel with no other option than to take action as it had said it would do for many, many years. This was not a surprise, to take action to prevent the imminent threat posed by Iran to the existence of the state of Israel. And we can talk more about the legal justification, but as a factual matter, the clock was about to strike midnight. Israel had no choice but to take action.
So let's just dig into that. You referred to the International Atomic Energy Agency's resolution on Thursday the 12th. Did that speak specifically about the number of warheads that the Iranians might be able to build? Where did the number of 9 atomic bombs come from? Was that
The number of 10 warheads assemblable within a week or two is from other sources. The Israeli government has said that. The US government has not said that. The US government has not made any official pronouncement about this, except one statement from the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who estimated that Iran was further away. But again, I would remind everyone that 10 years ago, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and the EU and the Obama White House all said the reason we need to do a nuclear deal now in 2015 with Iran is because Iran is 2 to 3 months away from developing a bomb.
Mm. So Thursday last week was the end of the 60-day period that Trump, I think, had given the Iranians to negotiate. Is that connected, that the expiration of that 60 days, was that the moment that Israel said, well, if the Iranians are not able and willing to reach a deal, that they felt justified, or did they take that as evidence then that the Iranians were unwilling to compromise? How do we explain that?
Yeah, as you recall, the Trump administration did give the Iranians 60 days to negotiate. The Trump administration made incredible efforts during those 60 days to meet with the Iranians multiple times in Oman and in Rome, to make very reasonable offers to the Iranians to back away from the precipice. And it was clear during those 60 days that Iran had no interest in negotiating seriously, that Iran's objective was to run the clock out on the October expiration of the JCPOA to avoid the imposition of so-called snapback sanctions by the other members of the Security Council and the European Union, who still have the ability to do that. And when it became very clear that a deal would not be reached within 60 days, the Israelis, who held fire during those 60 days out of respect for the Trump administration's effort to try to reach a diplomatic resolution, when the 60 days ended, there was no longer a constraint, a diplomatic or political constraint on Israel to act. Note, it was Israel that took action, not the United States, at the end of the 60 days. But President Trump has subsequently said that he was aware, fully aware, of what Israel intended to do on June 13, on day 61. And the president has been incredibly supportive of Israel ever since in his public statements.
Well, at this moment, we're waiting to hear what the Americans are going to do. So I think on another occasion, we'll talk more about the role of the United States and maybe the relationship between Israel and the United States leading up to this. So I've seen arguments made by leading international lawyers to say, well, this is illegal because this is actually the commencement of the use of force. The use of force is only justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter if you're acting in self-defense. And lawyers are more or less unanimous in the view that to be justified, there has to be a threat of an imminent attack, and there's no evidence of the imminence of the attack. There's a lot of rhetoric. They say that the Iranian Ayatollah's rhetoric is no different from probably the Israelis' rhetoric on the 8th of October and 7th of October. We can't take it literally, etc., etc. I think what I hear you saying is, well, look, if you look at the history of this regime since 1979, there's abundant evidence that the regime, it's not rhetoric, this is policy, national policy to eliminate Israel. What's your reading? How would you argue on this issue?
And so there are two separate, independent, equally valid justifications under international law for the current Israeli military campaign in Iran. The first justification is that on October the 7th, 2023, Iran, through its proxy Hamas, launched an armed aggression, an armed attack against the state of Israel when Hamas invaded, slaughtering 1,200 Israelis, taking 251 people hostage, launching 5,000 rockets into Israel. There is ample evidence, first reported by the Wall Street Journal several days later, and since bolstered by captured Hamas documents in the war. There is ample evidence that Iran greenlighted the Hamas attack against Israel. The next day, October the 8th, 2023, another Iranian proxy, the Hezbollah terrorist organization in Lebanon, began firing fusillades of rockets into northern Israel, displacing nearly 100,000 Israelis from their towns and villages and homes in northern Israel. Hezbollah effectively for years has functioned as a part of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Command. The Iranian general in charge of Hezbollah was based in Damascus. The Israelis took him out in March of 2024. The Iranian ambassador to Lebanon was wearing a Hezbollah pager on his belt when the pagers exploded in September of 2024. He was one of the people that was injured. Qasem Soleimani, the former head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Command, who the Americans took out several years ago, he had arrived on a flight from Beirut to Baghdad, where the Americans took him out. And so Hezbollah, for years, has functioned as an arm of the IRGC. And when they attacked Israel on October the 8th, 2023, that was an Iranian attack. Now, to the extent that Iran was responsible legally for the armed attacks on Israel on October 7 and October 8, 2023, Israel, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, had every right at that time, to respond militarily against Iran. Israel chose not to do so at that time because at that time, Hezbollah had more than 100,000 rockets and missiles in its arsenal that it could have used to retaliate against Israel. And so before responding to Iran, Israel needed to deal with the threat from Hamas and the threat from Hezbollah. As I mentioned, Israel took out the Iranian general in Syria who was commanding and giving orders to Hezbollah. Iran then directly attacked Israel in April of 2024. Israel responded with a very, very light hit on one radar near one Iranian nuclear facility. You may remember President Biden telling the Israelis not to go further, to take the win, quote unquote. And then following the Israeli assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the so-called political head of Hamas, while he was in a guest house in Tehran, following the Israeli assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, Iran launched more than 100 ballistic missiles at Israel on October 1, 2024. Israel again responding, although fairly lightly, targeting Iranian radars and air defense systems. And so Israel had every right, as a result of the October 7, October 8 Hamas and Hezbollah attacks and the war that launched, to respond militarily. And my view is that the Israeli attack against Iran last week is part of the war that Iran itself started against Israel on October 7, 2023. This has all been part of one large, complex, dynamic war. Israel has had the right to respond militarily in self-defense ever since October 7th. So that's the first justification. The second justification, separate and apart, is that under Article 51, which preserves the inherent right of self-defense, meaning the traditional, customary international law right of a state to respond to an imminent threat. In other words, you don't have to wait until you get punched. You can punch first, as Israel did in June of 1967, when Egypt and Syria were threatening to wipe it off the map. Israel struck first, wiping out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in Cairo. This time, same story. Iran on the brink of assembling 10 nuclear weapons, which for decades Iran has threatened to use to destroy Israel. What was Israel supposed to do? Wait for a nuclear weapon to be launched at Tel Aviv, or strike first in self-defense, in anticipatory self-defense, an inherent right preserved to states by Article 51. So these are two separate justifications. Either way, Israel's conduct with respect to its current campaign against Iran, completely legal and justified under international law.
Thanks very much. So on the second one, I mean, the issue will be this question of imminence and the proof of these 10. reminds me a little bit of the Iraq War in 2003. The whole idea that um, there were weapons of mass destruction and the whole thing was built around, and at the end of the day, there weren't. At least it's not proven there were. Do you think Israel can prove, is it willing to prove, will it disclose the intelligence that it had and has of the production of nuclear weapons?
Oh, sure. Israel has already, as you remember, years ago, in an incredibly daring and successful Mossad operation, stolen the entire Iranian nuclear archive. The documents in that archive showing that Iran was
Yeah,
racing to pursue nuclear weapons again to
yeah,
destroy Israel. That's number one. Number two, we have the IAEA report and resolutions totally separate from the Israeli government. Again, not specifically talking about 10 bombs within 2 weeks, but making very clear that Iran was lying to the international community, deceiving the international inspectors, doing everything it could behind the backs of the international community to achieve nuclear weapons capability.
yeah.
Um, and the Israelis, uh, and no one can doubt the Israeli intelligence capacity, targeting the leadership, taking them out of the IRGC, the head of Iranian intelligence, targeting and taking out the top Iranian nuclear scientists, the pager operation in Lebanon. I would be very, very reluctant to second guess an assessment by the government of Israel that Iran was on the brink of assembling nuclear weapons. The timing here was driven solely by that, and any
Mm,
speculation that there were other things going on here that caused
yeah,
Israel to go
yeah.
now internal politics in Israel and all that. That's nonsense. That is utter nonsense.
International law has two areas, doesn't it? The jus ad bellum and the jus in bello. So the first is the law, the rules governing when you can enter into war. And the
Right.
second one, the rules about when you are actually in the conduct. Now, the
Correct.
rules of proportionality and necessity apply, I think, in both cases. But the concept of an imminent threat only arises when you're talking about your scenario, your second scenario that you presented. Even if you say this is not part of an ongoing war, but the initiation, you're entitled to do that if the threat is imminent. Um,
Correct.
to what extent does international law give leeway to let's say, the defensive state, right? Because in the US in bello situation, the question of proportionality is to some extent subjective, isn't it? The commander responsible in any strike decision to take an action looks at the situation at that moment, and according to the information he has at that moment. Does international law give Israel a kind of a scope of discretion, or does the world have the opportunity to second guess Israel and decide for it whether it was justified in claiming that the threat was imminent?
So proportionality is a very, very squishy,
Mm,
ill-defined concept under international law. Some scholars take a quantitative approach. If your enemy kills 10 of your people, you can only kill 10 of their people in response. Some take a qualitative approach. Um, and I think the better approach is to take a comparative approach. How has Israel been waging these battles versus how, for example, Russia is indiscriminately targeting shopping centers and civilian apartment buildings and
mm,
train stations, civilian rail stations, and other conflicts around the world where the use of force is grossly disproportionate to
mm,
the threats faced in this
mm,
situation. Israel is doing in Iran exactly what it did in Gaza, warning civilians in advance to take cover,
mm,
telegraphing its strikes in advance to give civilians a chance to get out of harm's way, attacking only military targets, not
mm,
firing indiscriminately into civilian populations, as Hamas did to
Hmm.
Israel, as Hezbollah did to Israel, and as Iran
Iran
did
is
to
now
Israel
doing. This
today.
is Iran is now firing missiles into civilian areas in Israel.
Yes, Iran has been targeting civilian areas to terrorize the population, striking the Soroka Hospital in
Yeah,
Beersheba
yeah.
this morning, striking areas in Holon and Ramat Gan this morning, and elsewhere over the last few days. Iran claimed this morning they were aiming for a military target. The closest military target to the Soroka Hospital is 10.5 kilometers away. Um, this is clearly meant to terrorize. There is no relationship between a military objective of Iran and the attacks, the indiscriminate attacks on civilians. Israel is the only country in the world, in the entire world, that warns civilians in advance to take cover. Israel is the only country in the entire world that pauses its fighting to, in the case of Gaza, to allow aid to come in, to allow 500,000 people to be vaccinated for polio. No other army in the history of warfare, in human history, has ever done
Hmm.
anything remotely similar to that. And so
Hmm.
those who claim that Israel's conduct of the wars, or the war, the single wars, I argue, violates the notion or the principles of jus in bello or international humanitarian law, so-called IHL, because their response is allegedly disproportionate, are ignoring the facts. They're simply ignoring the facts.
Hmm.
And no lawyer worth their salt would make a legal argument based on facts that are not true.
Thanks, Steve. No, there's so much more we're going to talk about. I know we're under a deadline here. I think you've got to run. This has been a great conversation, very important. Thank you for your analysis. And
Thank you,
I'm
Andrew.
looking forward. We're going to talk more as this conflict continues, which it inevitably will for some time. Big question whether America will intervene. Lots of things can happen. Thank you so much, Professor
Thank
Steve
you, Andrew.
Zipperstein. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Okay.